I'd like him to welcome to the show Jeffrey Manne, president and founder of the International Center for Law and Economics. Welcome to Free the Economy, Jeff.
Thanks, Richard. Great to be here.
All right, so we are going to talk about the evolution of the entertainment industry and the forces between the people like the writers and the actors on one side and the big studios and networks on the other. But before we get to details of that, can you tell the listeners how you ended up writing about this topic and what is in your like profession and background that
Sure.
made this something you wanted to engage with?
Sure. I mean, my main intellectual interest is antitrust, competition law, and competition policy. So I've been thinking for many years about the way industries are organized and the way businesses are organized and the way businesses operate and how that may or may not promote consumer welfare or promote competition or harm, competitive processes in various markets. And the sort of film industry, it's kind of hard to know what to call it now, which is actually
Hmm.
part of what we'll talk about because there was a time when it was a little bit more straightforward. It was, a couple of Hollywood studios, they made films, they were distributed in theaters, and that's, what we were talking about. Now it's obviously much more complicated than that. I may use different terms, but let's call it the video entertainment industry, something like that. It's for a long time been of great interest in competition law and policy. It's as a matter of sort of the way the business is organized, it's really fascinating, far more complicated than we have time to talk about today. But just by way of suggesting that pretty much anybody, I think, who has an interest in the way business is structured, and in particular its competitive implications, has probably thought about the movie industry. The reason it's become more salient recently is because Lena Khan, the chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, has recently um, done a couple of interviews and made a couple of statements to suggest that she, in particular, is very concerned with the state of the industry, the state of competition in this industry. And on top of that, as you may recall, just last year we had a huge writer's strike. And part of what underlay that the writer's strike was claimed concerns by the Writers Union, the Writers Guild of America, about consolidation and the structure of this industry and how it was affecting their members. That's also part of what Lena Khan suggested was her concern. So, when mainstream media is looking at an industry that I've been, looking at from a more sort of scholarly perspective, my ears always perk up, and there's a lot to think about and talk about in this industry, and of course it touches everyone, right? So it's a great topic, a great way to think about or learn about competition law and competition policy because it's something everyone's familiar with. Otherwise, we're talking about the cement industry, and no one really cares about
I find this been industry fascinating, but
that.
I understand undergraduates and law students probably more interested in what's on TV.
Yeah.
So last year, like you mentioned, we had this major labor dispute. We had the Writers Guild of America, basically like Hollywood writers, although I'm sure they have plenty of members live in other places, and
Yeah.
Screen Actors Guild. And so that was a big thing in the news. Some, people's favorite shows got a little interrupted.
Right.
Um, so between those two sort of creative unions, those groups of workers, and the big movie studios and sort of streaming companies, what was the main thing that was the issue there? What were the uh, sort of union negotiators upset about, and what did they want to get out of it?
Um, so I think honestly, the thing that was most at issue there, it was is representative of, indicative of the biggest, most significant shift that's going on in this whole industry. And it really dealt with how writers and actors, creatives would get paid for productions that were distributed on streaming services, Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu, HBO Max, Amazon, Apple Plus, right? I guess are the big ones.
Right.
Disney, sorry, can't forget Disney. Um, And it presents actually a really interesting problem. Remember, I said before, it used to be very straightforward how this industry worked. It used to be that you had a studio, you made a movie, you distributed it through theaters. Uh, you the the source of revenue for any given movie was box office revenue, right? You sort of had um, a very clear source um, of return on your investment in the film, and then that was the pool from which you could distribute resources, you could distribute profits to the various creatives who were and business people who were involved in making the movie. Now, obviously, that I mean, now I'm thinking of the 30s. That's changed a little bit, right? In subsequent years, there's merchandising that's an important source of revenue. There's syndication on cable, on television, that's an important source of revenue. It's more complicated than just the traditional model, but it's infinitely more complicated in a world in which a vast amount, maybe the majority of content is currently being distributed through streaming services. And the main reason that it's more complicated is because there is no direct return on those investments. It's not like if you uh spend $1 billion making a movie and put it on a streaming service, you can then tie your revenue to that specific production, right? Rather, people pay subscriptions for their streaming services, and they don't pay more or less depending on which shows they're watching. Um, and even to make matters even more complicated, if you spend $1 billion making one of these large productions and it's being watched by people who are already subscribers to your subscription service, you may not be making any marginal increase in revenue from those people, right?
Right.
So how do you figure out how much this movie that you spent $1 billion on is returning to the studio or to the various creatives who are involved in making it, and how do you distribute that? And the Writers Guild and the Screen Actors Guild wanted, I think actually in this sense, quite reasonably enough, uh, thought that their contract should look different than they had looked before, because you couldn't just rely on the traditional models of compensation for determining how much money they would get for. I should add this as well. Sorry, a lot of the payment, as you may know, for creatives in these productions is not upfront. It's based on residuals in the past,
Right.
anyway. You might get paid something, of course, for if you're a big marquee star or something, but chances are somewhere between some and all of your payment from working on a movie is going to come from residuals, from how much the movie earns once it's out there in the world and being watched by people. So it's like a profit sharing sort of mechanism.
Right. So, so recently we had that dispute over payment. Like you said, a lot of it is over. How do you figure payments over for streaming
Right.
when people don't pay per view for each each movie or each show? But the Writers Guild of America also put out their own sort of report and analysis about the state of the sort of entertainment media landscape in general, and made a lot of sort of characterizations about how they think it's organized, how they think it should change, what parts of it they think are good and bad.
Yeah.
Um, and obviously, if uh, if an analysis like that says, "Oh wow, the industry is organized in some sort of terrible, suboptimal way," that of course gives ammunition to the people who want to say, "Oh, well, we need government policy to step in and change it." So
Right.
the kind of arguments in here are could be pretty relevant to the future of the industry. Um, and one of the arguments here seems to be that there's a relatively small handful of big companies that handle a lot of this material, and that uh, in traditional kind of like antitrust analysis, you would say, oh, a small number of companies might have uh, the incentive to constrict supply
Right.
and then therefore be able to exploit their workers. In this case, these like creative workers. Um, but how does that look? How does that argument stack up? The sort of 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act kind of argument stand up to a world where there are like dozens of streaming services. Like you've been rattle off the names of the most famous ones, but there's more than that. There's more being kind of launched all the time. It feels like every big entertainment company has to have its own streaming platform now.
Right.
Aren't barriers actually lower? Do we actually have more content than before?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot in that question, Richard. The first thing I'll start with is a point that you made that I should have mentioned before, which is while I think the real dispute in the writers' strike was over how to distribute the lack of profits from streaming. The stated dispute was not necessarily that, right? I mean, the sort of sound bites were often about consolidation in the industry and the way the counterparties, I can't you can't really call them the studios anymore, but let's just think of them as studios. The studios were had so much bargaining power that they were keeping profits for themselves and not providing the fair share to the writers and actors. um, and you're absolutely right that the WGA in particular has written a bunch to suggest that the structure of this industry is highly concentrated. There's insufficient competition, and that those studios and streaming services are keeping more money for themselves because they don't face enough competition to require them to distribute it to the people who are actually contributing to making the show. Um, and I think you're absolutely right that it's a really, really hard position to maintain if you just take a little bit of a look at the industry today. So first of all, I think you're right. There's more content than there has ever been. Um, Not only is that content being so one of the arguments, of course, is that these industries, these entities are vertically integrating. They're producing excuse me, they're creating their own shows, they're producing their own shows, they're distributing their own shows. In the old days, I mean, that's always been somewhat true in this industry, but in the old days you might have expected, they would say, perhaps, to see independent production companies, independent writers and others pitching their ideas to the studios, who would then purchase them, and there would be a bunch of competition for the most potentially valuable properties. It turns out that's actually still true, and maybe more true than it used to be. It's a lie to suggest that the industry has so consolidated now that Apple is producing its own shows and not buying external shows, and that you can't be an independent studio and produce content that actually gets purchased by the today's distributors, mostly the streaming services. None of that's true, and in fact, there's so much more content, and there's in particular, if you think internationally, the rise of these streaming services has brought in content from all over the world that people in the US in particular never had any access to before. That the amount of content is actually far, far higher than it has been in the past. The competition for that high quality content is as robust as it's ever been. And it may very well be that the real problem that is plaguing writers and many creatives out there is that there's so much content that they aren't operating in the world of the same kind of scarcity that they once were. Um, you made the point about how the Hollywood writers are the ones who are on strike, and you're absolutely right. Most writers probably don't live in Hollywood, and in a world in which we're seeing these very popular shows coming from Spain and France and India and China, um, they may not even live in the United States, right? Now you've opened up the world to, instead of it being a small pool of, I'm totally making up these numbers, 20 writers who used to be competing for the top shows. Now it's 20 million writers who are competing. Of course, your take is going to go down. It's not because of a lack of competition on the buyer side, it's because of an excess of competition, or a massive amount of competition on the seller side, where you're selling shows, right? That actually raises an interesting question. It's another interesting question implicated by your question, which is whose interest are we supposed to be protecting with the antitrust laws?
That's a good
Um,
that is a good question.
it's a very hard, difficult question. It's one that's being asked quite a bit these days in the antitrust world. Um, but the first answer to that question is has always been, or has been, as long as antitrust has been a robust discipline, so for the last almost 100 years, but really let's say the last 60 years, 70 years, has been the consumers. And in this context, by consumers, we tend to mean the people who watch movies, who watch video entertainment. Um, from their perspective, I think it would be absolutely impossible to suggest that the market has deteriorated from what it once was. Whatever you think of the structure, whether everybody has their views about how a particular market structure might be better or worse for competition. All we can do is look at what we have. Maybe there's some theoretical market structure that would be better, but what with the structure we have today, consumers have more access to more content than they ever have before, more than they could possibly watch, and I should add, at lower prices than it's ever cost before. So, like the WGA and others have suggested, well, because of this consolidation, these companies that with lots of market power, like Netflix, can raise their prices. And indeed, Netflix did raise its prices last year from whatever it is. I don't know, $15 a month to $16 a month or something like that. Meanwhile, Netflix is the only one of these streaming services that has even come close to turning a profit. They're still losing money. And that $15 a month is a small fraction of what you would have had to pay to get that amount of content in a world, certainly in a world dominated by theatrical distribution, but even in a world dominated by cable distribution. So prices are down, content is up, the quality is arguably higher than it's ever been, but that's a judgment call that no one can really assess. Quick footnote: the people who are critics of the industry today are very quick to suggest that quality is lower than it's been, as if they're the arbiters of quality or something. So from the consumer perspective, the video viewing perspective, I think you can only conclude that the market is offering more and better products at lower prices than it ever has in the past. Not a bad thing for consumers. So what
Yeah,
about
and
the yeah, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, please.
no, I was just going to say that, when, like you said, well, if we're looking at this from an antitrust perspective, do we need some sort of antitrust oversight or enforcement or something like that? Should, at what point would there be enough of a problem for, say, you would say the government to step in? Chairwoman Khan might say have a very low bar for
Yeah,
where she
sure.
says government should be stepping in. But one of the important questions, like, well, whose interests are we enforcing here, right? And uh, I think sometimes people from like the labor side like to say, "Oh, well, we're all in this together, right? What's good for one is good for another, good, consumers and workers, and it's all a win-win-win." But when it comes to competition, right? Competition's supposed to drive down prices, right? And hopefully, over the long term, both drive down prices and increase quality at the same time. Uh, but less money, less revenue coming in is not good for the actors and the writers, right? They would, uh, it's common for sort of corporate critics to say like, oh, well, these big companies, they want to produce as little as much as the highest possible, revenue and profit. Um, but isn't that actually what would benefit the writers and actors just as much, right? That, uh, so it seems like they're sort of trying to be on the side of the consumer and say, oh, it's us creative workers and you, the consumers, on one side, and it's the big greedy corporations on the other
Yeah.
side. But it seems like higher prices for consumers is exactly what those people would want themselves, as long as they got a bigger slice of it than the distributors and networks, right?
Yeah. I mean, it really is. There are two interrelated questions about the amount of revenue that's earned, by selling these products, these video products, and then how it's distributed. And from the writer's perspective, I don't think they really care whether there's more revenue, a bigger pie for them to share, or they get a bigger slice of a smaller pie. I think they just want a bigger slice, right? And the problem with that is, as you said, there are some dimensions on which the interests of viewers and writers are in fact perfectly aligned, as you suggested. And there are others, when it comes to writers taking a bigger share of the pie, where they're not necessarily aligned. And the reason I think that's particularly poignant in the industry today is because of what I mentioned a minute ago, which is that um, as the primary mode of film distribution is turning to streaming, we have a very new, very much in flux kind of market in which no one has yet really figured out exactly what the sustainable sort of equilibrium is for this market. I'd have to look it up and double check. I think Netflix is finally, depending on how you measure it, turning something of a profit, but I don't think anyone else is. And it's not surprising because of that dynamic I mentioned before, because you spend $30 million an episode or whatever it is, and you have no marginal return on that spending because maybe you attract a few more subscribers to your service because they want access to this show that you have, right? But that's in no way necessarily commensurate with the expense of the show. So it's not surprising that these streaming services are having a hard time figuring out what the right business model is, how to charge, how to turn a profit. And the reason that's particularly poignant here is because the writers and actors, for that matter, want a bigger share of a system in which there may be no profits to distribute. I mean, and in a system in which if they get their way, or at least the extreme of their ways, it can only lead to fewer profits, right? Because it's higher cost. It means sort of less production. It ultimately may mean less value being produced for consumers, which means consumers aren't willing to pay as much for the services, et cetera, et cetera. It's like a vicious cycle. Um, so one of the things that I think is really, this bring to sort of bring all of this together is one of the things that I think is really kind of problematic about this dispute between the writers and actors and the production companies and the studios. One of the things that I think is really problematic about it today is that it's a really bad time for that. It's not at all surprising. Everybody should get, they should get what they can out of these, arm's length, freely negotiated contracts. But right now, the industry is in so much flux that suggesting that we know what the industry looks like and we know that its structure is constraining the amount or the ability for writers and other creatives to get their sort of, fair share is insane. We simply do not know that. And in fact, if you sort of intervene mistake in the wrong way now, you might prevent that industry from ever getting to the point where it is a sort of, you know, understood, self-sustaining, kind of in an equilibrium um, uh, where revenue, where the whole sort of thing is predictable, where we can anticipate what kind of revenue we're going to have, so we can enter into contracts with writers and artists to give them their fair due, and we can provide something of value to consumers. That's, to me, that's the real danger, is the intervention. I mean, intervention is always dangerous, right? The sort of intervening in free markets is always a little bit dangerous, but it's really dangerous when the market is in such flux and it's so unclear how it's going to shake out.
Yeah, and uh, the the point about payments in an industry that is largely not profitable by standard accounting
Yeah,
practices, a lot of you know, performers have said, "Oh, well, I don't, I don't just want this sort of upfront sort of stipend-like fixed payment when I do something. I want points, right? I want some percentage of either the profit, or if you're really a big player, gross revenues. But if their premise is, I want a piece of the action, but the action is literally negative, right? Right, it's costing the producers more to create this than they're bringing back. That none of them want to work for a percentage in that situation, right? It's
no,
like, well, your
no, I'm
share
sure
of
they're
our
very
losses this
careful about
quarter
how
is
they
$1 million
define it.
dollars, so
Yeah,
that's obviously not. So
yeah,
I don't think you can fault people for opening a negotiation with the best offer from their perspective.
of course not.
But if you say, well, we absolutely want a percentage of the profits, and then when there's no profits, then we want the opposite, whatever, whatever's in our favor. We don't have to assume that they are acting in everyone's interests.
Correct.
That's obviously just a
And
self.
and that version is not sustainable, right? I mean, it's just not. You can't be only sharing in the upside and not contributing or sharing in the downside. The industry that operates like that will go bankrupt.
Well, yeah, and I think about that when there's some of these populist, I think, and this may be more left populist, but where there's plenty of like right populist, capitalist critics as well these days. But someone like Bernie Sanders, for example, once when he was running for president one or more times, he talked about how he thought big public companies should put worker, probably union representatives, but worker representatives on their boards. And he and plenty of other people with kind of similar kind of democratic socialist outlooks on the economy would say, well, we should treat, all the profits shouldn't go to the shareholders. We should treat workers more like shareholders, right? They
Mm,
should have more control over the company. They should have a bigger share of the profits. But just like in this case, no one expects the like shift supervisor at a factory to take the hit when the company is not profitable for a quarter or a year, right? No one's
Yeah.
going to say everyone at the factory should work for negative $11 an hour until we get back into profitable operations, right?
Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
but
we should be, I guess, clear about this as well. That when the WGA is out there negotiating for their contract with the studios and the like, they're not negotiating on behalf of Steven Spielberg or Reese Witherspoon or whoever. They're negotiating the sort of baseline contract for the non-stars, right? The stars are always going to get their due because they are particularly useful in generating revenue. Um, and one of the things that I think is kind of really disappointing about the way the uh, unions approach their negotiations with the studios in this most recent sort of strike era. And you're right, wasn't just the writers; it was also the actors. Is that they assumed and as much explicitly stated that there was this inherent and intractable conflict between the studios and the writers as a whole or the actors as a whole. There's actually probably more of a conflict between the superstar actors and the baseline actors and the superstar writers and the sort of baseline writers than there is between the studios and those. One of the reasons that it's so expensive to make these films today, I mean, there are lots of reasons, and I don't want to suggest that it's only this, but writers and actors, marquee actors, which attract viewers, make huge amounts of the profits, right? A lot of the money is spent on personnel, um, and it's not like it's hard to. I don't want to suggest that the studios or anyone else should be constrained in how they write these contracts. Tom Cruise should get as much as he can, but but if the if Netflix itself is not really turning a profit, but Tom Cruise is making $1 billion a movie, you might think that the source of funds from which you should be looking for, excess for the baseline workers is Tom Cruise's salary, not Netflix's profits. And I guess what I'm trying to say in all of this is that these kinds of business models are extraordinarily complicated, and it absolutely transcends the idea that there's, capital versus workers. It's sort of crazy to think, especially in an environment in which a Netflix is not turning much of a profit, that they're the ones who are withholding something from the workers who they employ, and when at the same time, Tom Cruise is making $1 billion a movie. So I mean, again, I don't want to fault Tom Cruise either, but I do think it helps to illustrate how the simplistic narrative is really not a very helpful one, especially again in an industry that's always had very complicated business models and that is undergoing a really seismic transition right now.
well, yeah, and I think in Tom Cruise's defense, probably some of that money gets tithed to the Church of Scientology, so he's not taking all that home.
So
Uh,
you're right. I shouldn't assume that it's all profit for him either. It's not. Yeah.
so some of these criticisms, again, going back to looking at this, like, is this an antitrust problem or not?
No.
Have to do with the idea that there are a handful of large companies that have a lot of market share. I always hate using the word control the market because I don't think in any meaningful sense they do control it. Certainly not over the long term, although that's often how it's phrased. But it's the this criticism goes back a long, long time, possibly almost to the early Wildcat days when there were a bunch of the silent era, 1915 when there was a bunch of people making their own
Yeah.
independent movies. Uh, there was the old studio system, the big
Right.
three TV broadcast networks, and then a handful of cable operators across the country.
Yeah.
Um, so in other words, there's always been a certain amount of media consolidation, and it's always been like that, even in different formats. But in a way, shouldn't we expect that to be the case, right? Because these are big, complicated, capital-intensive enterprises. Would
Right.
it ever even make economic sense for there to be 50 of these or
No,
100 of these?
it's exactly why the or one of the reasons why the streaming business model is having so much trouble right now. As you pointed out, there are a lot of streaming services. I don't think anyone thinks that the number of streaming services we have today is really sustainable in the long run. There's probably going to have to be consolidation for exactly the reason you suggested. We shouldn't think that's a bad thing. It may be the only thing that enables this kind of business to survive. There was one example I can give of this. I can remember the numbers. Was I think it's in the piece you mentioned, so I want to get the numbers right because it's really interesting. Sorry, I can't. Oh yeah, okay, yeah. Disney spent more than $500 million on three shows: Marvel's Moon Knight, Secret Invasion, and Loki season two. Um, uh, you know, if they had each been released in movie theaters or sold to networks or something like that, I think it's highly unlikely that they would have collectively, earned $500 million. But again, I just want to point out that having spent $500 million on these three shows, the revenue that Disney earned from them coming from subscription on Disney Plus could have been literally zero. I mean, it probably wasn't zero. Those shows probably attracted some new subscribers. It was probably, um something, tens of millions of dollars, but a tiny fraction. And this in a world in which in which you're spending this kind of money to produce shows that may or may not, and in the streaming world almost certainly won't yield a sort of direct and and uh correlated return. Yeah, you have to find a way to it's like the pharmaceutical industry, right? You're spending huge amounts of money on what effectively is R&D. You have one hit out of 10, 50, 20, sorry, 10, 50, 100 efforts at creating a drug. That one hit has to finance all of the drugs that end up being failures. And in the classic movie industry, that's how it always worked. Your one big hit would finance both the artsy movies that didn't get that much return and the big failures. And now you have this added wrinkle that even the hits are not in a position to finance the misses because you don't have a marginal return commensurate with the expense on the hits. Um, to think that we could have a world in which you'd have 1,000 different studios sort of competing with each other in that kind of environment, it's utterly impossible. You simply couldn't sustain that kind of environment. So we should actually welcome some consolidation in this industry. As you're right, we've always seen it because it is so capital intensive. And I think it's just worth adding. I think you've mentioned this before, and maybe I have too. Um, Relative to times prior, we're actually in a world of less consolidation than we've had before. There are more ways to see filmed entertainment content today than there have ever been in the past. The number of distribution channels is bigger. The number of the places and times and ways of paying for video content today are massively greater than they've ever been before. This doesn't sound like an industry that is is centralizing and consolidating excuse me, needlessly, simply to extract more resources from others. It seems like an industry that's generating quite a bit of value and just trying to find a way to make that sustainable. A little bit like airlines too, by the way. And airlines is a kind of, I just want to throw this out there because you know we also have constantly seen this in airlines, but the difference with the airlines is that or not the difference, because we're going to see this in this industry too, is recall that airlines constantly are going bankrupt, right? I mean, it's just like the norm in that industry is slight downturn in the market leads to bankruptcy, and you reorganize and you come out again, right? But you're sort of so precarious and so dependent on the nature of supply and demand in that industry that you have this sort of constant string of bankruptcies. um I think that we're going to have to see something a little bit like that in this industry too, at least during this sort of transition period.
Yeah, but I definitely take the point you made earlier, which is that it's really hard to it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. It is it's and it's impossible to say with any technical specificity what media consolidation, the media creative landscape is going to be in the
Yep.
future. If someone knew that they would have, $1 billion bet on black right there in
Right,
front of them.
right.
And I'm thinking about the obviously very related industry of recorded music. So I'm sure
Sure.
you've seen this chart before. It's been posted a million times of where the revenue came from in recorded music for the past 70 years. And so you go back a long ways, and it was vinyl, right? Tons of vinyl LPs. Consumers were buying, and then it begins to change a little, and then there's a little blip in the 70s where people are buying 8 tracks, right? And then they start buying cassette tapes, and then you really see the LP sales go down, down, down as a percentage,
This is true.
and in absolute terms. And then there's like a tiny blip in the early 2000s where people are actually paying for ringtones from recognizable pop songs, and that's like a
Right.
little a little nugget there. And then, but now, of course, then it was MP3 downloads, and now it's all streaming. It's the vast majority of it.
Right.
Um, and
Yeah,
you
that is
know,
a better parallel than the airline industry. I should have thought of that. Yeah. Very, very close, right? Yeah.
so no one could have predicted where those lines on that chart would go. Some people could probably have predicted that once CDs came around, I think maybe I left CDs out, but they were there too. That CDs were going to cut into LP sales. We probably don't have to be a genius forecaster
Yeah.
to have seen that coming. But the the total and the detailed breakdown of what's going to make more money versus what in 5 or 10 or 20 or 25 years, no one knew that, right? And you had
Yeah.
plenty of people who, if they had known, would have tried to stop it, right? Because they've been a record producer for 40 years and they
They
they they
did.
like the
They
industry
did
the
try
way
to
it
stop.
is. Um, so it seems to me there's sort of an analogy there to, uh, you know, visual media, recorded video, movies and TV shows, where, you know, like you said, we know there's going to be change, but we can't know exactly what direction it's going to go in. So having, say, you know, the FTC come in or somebody else and say, well, we think the industry might be, tending in a direction that's going to disadvantage this subset of workers. So we're going to, regulate and try and, force it in another direction. Um, that seems not great.
That's an understatement, of course. Yeah. It's very much not great. Um, uh, I mean, it's always a problem with antitrust, of course. It's the error cost problem. The concern that an overly aggressive antitrust, which for some people is any antitrust, reasonably so, um, is more likely to curtail pro-competitive activity than to stop anti-competitive activity. And in technologically advanced industries, in industries that are going through a lot of flux, and by technologically advanced, I guess I mean, really, we're talking about any industry here, right? Any industry that could be affected by technology such that it changes the very makeup of the industry. In anything like that, you're almost guaranteed to get it wrong by intervening, and you're especially guaranteed to get it wrong again, as I keep saying, in like sometimes you don't know when those big changes are coming. So at least you have the excuse of saying, well, we thought things were pretty well settled and we intervened because given that things were settled, there was a problem and we didn't know that streaming was going to come along, sorry. You don't have that excuse today because we know streaming is coming along. We are absolutely in the midst of this again sort of seismic transformation in the industry that is absolutely no question the wrong time to intervene. Intervening right now would only make things worse. Now that may always be true, but it is absolutely true. Right? It's true in spades right now. But what's interesting to me is it's probably also in exactly that environment that the demands for intervention are higher, right? I mean, it's when things are transitioning, when writers aren't still getting paid in exactly the same way they used to and think they deserve more, or when it's the companies themselves who are the drivers of this. When a company that was doing great in an environment in which distribution was done through theatrical distribution, and all of a sudden is struggling in a streaming environment, they're absolutely going to be screaming at the top of their lungs about how awful the streaming environment is, right? So it's weird, or not weird, it's particularly problematic. It's very much a sort of bootleggers and Baptist story, that in precisely the environment in which you should be intervening less, you are going to have the strongest voices telling you you need to intervene, and you really have to resist that.
Well, yeah, and I think, I mean, another thing about looking at from like an antitrust lens is what is the market here? So, when you look and you say, well, here's a market for X, and there's five companies have 80% market share, and that yields a certain
Yeah,
index number of concentration, and then, that's how you look at it. Uh, you know, People who are, critics of aggressive antitrust enforcement would say, well, sometimes there's a relevant market fallacy, and you've measured the relevant market incorrectly, right? And
sure.
so the market is not the market for sneakers, the market is for the market for shoes, all right? Or maybe it's actually the market for all accessories, all clothing and accessories. And so which market are we trying to regulate here is the question. And so when it comes to entertainment, I think about this all the time where so you could say, we don't have like the best terminology yet. We say like streaming video or video production or movie and TV production is generally what we're talking about. So is that a relevant market from kind of an antitrust competition standpoint, or are we saying is music and movies together are one big entertainment, right? Or is it anything you might do with your leisure time,
How
right?
about video games?
Yeah, video games, perfect example, or going, in the broadest possible sense, other leisure time activities. So maybe Hulu Plus and riding your bike are both leisure time entertainment activities that are part of the same market. So,
The way I
what,
like to put it, Richard, is that, and it is specific to, or not specific to, but it's particularly poignant for the entertainment market. I like to say, watching the sunset, is that in the relevant market with watching a movie and video games? And there's no sort of rigorous empirical reason why it isn't in the same market. Now, it may be difficult to assess what a market looks like if you start to include everything. It's in fact virtually impossible. But I think you're absolutely right that there's an artificial limitation in suggesting that this industry is over concentrated, when in reality this industry competes very much with other industries and even non-industries like the sunset and anything that
but
people would do with their time.
well, yeah, I think some people would say, "Oh, well, that's a silly example. You can't monetize the sunset." But you can absolutely set up a camera, watch the sunset, and put that on YouTube. There are millions upon
Absolutely.
millions of YouTube videos of rain falling, of rivers running, of sun setting, of clouds going across the sky, and those are monetized and people are making money for them. So
Yeah, no, very
even
good.
even the seemingly silly example is an actual real example
Yeah, right.
of streaming video content that people are making money off of.
Right. I think it also raises another really interesting point, which is that uh, there's definitely a sort of a bias, I guess, against the it's I mean it is a bias against capitalists, of course, but in this kind of market it's a bias against the, I don't know, let's call them the facilitators. The critics always call them gatekeepers. That's how the WGA refers to these companies in its report and the like. And to me it's really interesting that you have these entities that are doing sort of an amazing job aggregating content and finding ways to maybe not perfectly yet, but finding ways to monetize them and satisfy massive heterogeneous preferences all around. I mean, kind of if you step back and think about what these platforms, and of course, obviously, if you referring to them that way, you can see I don't just mean in entertainment; they're happening all over. Kind of a modern marvel, and yet, um, very frequently the target of this kind of ire. There's sort of a sense that, I don't know, it's almost like a sense that you should be doing more and better, as if what they're doing isn't already this amazing marvel. What's interesting about it, I guess, the reason I think it's interesting is because by their nature, they are aggregating things. That's the way that it works. And so it's sort of a bad fit with antitrust. If your view of antitrust is, we're going to count the number of firms, or we're going to look at the size of firms or something like that as a proxy for the amount of competition, you have a clear conflict with industries in which these aggregators, these entities that are facilitating exchange that was simply not economical to happen before, they are very much centralizing things, and therefore they're big and they're controlling, as you said, it's not a great word, but controlling a lot of economy. And there's this just natural tension there. And the reason I thought of this as a consequence of what you just said is, like obviously you don't have that problem sort of with the sunset, or even with the, it's less of a problem with the very disaggregated, videos being put up on YouTube, but it's YouTube where people's ire is directed. And yet YouTube is the thing that's facilitating this massive amount of content that could never have been seen by anyone else in the world, except, you film the subset and you show it to your wife, and that even the next day, and that's it, right? That's all being facilitated by these kind of remarkable technological platforms. And yet, sort of ironically, they are being attacked as impediments to competition, because of sort of this nature of their design. I think it's problematic. I mean, it's a lot of hubris.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, there's definitely the case where once someone makes something that's good and valuable, we sort of take it for granted and then say, okay, well, now I want it at half the price. I
I
want
want it
twice as
free.
much.
Yeah, yeah,
And I want it for free. Well, I think that that's been actually a really good summary of the problems we're looking at.
it
So I want to thank you, Jeff, for coming on with us. This has really been
was a pleasure.
fascinating. Um, Next time I'll wear my Deadpool costume and to really get people pulled into it.
I'll wear my
Um,
Lady Deadpool costume.
so before we go, what tell people where to find you online, where to find your stuff, your writing, your organization, all this stuff.
Yeah, great. So I'm the president and founder of something called the International Center for Law and Economics. You can find us at laweconcenter.org online. We have a lot of interesting stuff on our website, like little primers and summaries of scholarship and things like that. In a lot of much in many of the areas we've been talking about, we definitely do a lot of antitrust stuff, but we do things related to technological, the regulation of technology and intellectual property, and um, telecommunications, a whole sort of wide range of things. So I recommend our website if you're interested in learning sort of more about these sort of issues.
Oh,
Was
and
that
also follow Jeff on Twitter.
what's that?
Also
Oh
follow
yeah, on
Jeff on,
Twitter. Yes, at I think my handle is Geoff Manne, GeoffManne.
yeah, it's funny people, you know, they forget because they never have to type it out themselves.
Yeah, no, I'm not 100% sure that's it actually. So you can put
You
it in
can
the
find
show
me.
notes or whatever, right?
Yeah,
So yeah.
I will link out. All right. Thanks again for joining us, Jeff.
Thanks, Richard. Happy to come anytime.